I mean, it's difficult for me to accept this, but I have to say that it's turned the whole concept of international criminal justice into just a joke. It's a sick joke. I mean, look, Russia invades Ukraine. Within 4 days, the ICC announced that they were conducting an investigation. Within around 11 months, so under a year, we have the head of state of Russia and all these politicos, they've received indictments. So, they act at a lightning speed. With Palestine, on the other hand, it took 6 years for them to even say, okay, we're opening an investigation. And even that was after all these kind of ridiculous legal maneuvers by the previous prosecutor, who was clearly just trying to weasel out of the whole thing. Jurisdiction, do we really have jurisdiction? It was just nonsense, just really, trying to kick the can down the road. So finally, after 6 years, that's all been that's all been sort of overcome. And finally, we have this investigation, which has started. It's been 3 years since then. And what do we have? Nothing.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal, and after 2 years of operating this channel from Tokyo and Kyoto, I finally have a Japanese expert with me. Saul Takahashi is a human rights lawyer who worked for 5 years in occupied Palestine in the Westbank city of Ramallah, where he served as deputy head of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Saul got his LLM in international human rights law from the University of Essex and later worked in the field in various positions around the globe. Today, Saul is a professor at the Osaka-based Chogakuin University. Recently, Saul published a forceful article in Al Jazeera entitled "Gaza Will Be the Grave of the Western-Led World Order," in which he thoroughly discusses the double standards and hypocrisy of the current international system, which includes actually international law. This is what we want to discuss today, so thank you, Saul, for coming online.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here, like they all say.
Thanks for that. Well, the article you wrote, or in the article, you wrote the following about the ICJ case, because you published it right before the verdict came out.
Yes.
The ICJ will either be remembered as the first step towards finally holding a rogue state accountable for repeated long-standing violations of international law, or as the last dying breath of a dysfunctional Western-led international system. Now, the ruling came out 5 days ago. What's your verdict?
Well, the jury is sort of still out, I guess. The verdict itself, or the decision on the provisional measures itself, is not all bad, but it's certainly not enough in my mind, and certainly in the opinion of a lot of the Palestinians that I've been in contact with and that you see interviewed in Al Jazeera and some other media. It's not, when I say it's not all bad, I mean that it is a defeat in many ways for Israel. That's quite clear. I mean, the Israeli arguments were just sort of brushed aside, and they deserved to be brushed aside. They were really ridiculous. I mean, I honestly don't believe that the Israeli delegation or the Israeli sort of lawyers, I don't think that they thought that they would win the arguments. I don't think that they thought they had a strong case. I mean, to me, it seemed very much like a PR exercise on their part, just sort of, going through the motions to be able to say that they, that they went with it and that they did their best, and the ICJ is biased against them and it's an anti-Semitic organization, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. So those were given short shrift. Certainly, like as many commentators have already said, the ICJ ruled that there is at least a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide, or at least is in danger of committing genocide. And that provisional measures are warranted and the case should not be thrown out, and the ICJ is going to look at the merits of the case. So in that regard, yes, I mean, it was certainly it was a step towards holding Israel accountable. But of course, like many people have already pointed out, it didn't go far enough. I mean, the ICJ did not rule in favor of a complete halt in military operations, as the South Africans had called for. And that's a big shortcoming. It's a big shortcoming of it, and especially if you look at the most recent sort of analogous decisions of the ICJ, they have a similar formulation in the case of Gambia versus Burma versus Myanmar in the case of the Rohingya. But with, of course, the case of the Ukraine, the case that Ukraine brought against Russia, they demand a complete ceasefire. They demand a complete halt, suspension of military operations. They demanded that of Russia. Of course, Russia ignored it, but that's one step down. So when we look at this and we see, look, these are double standards. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, how can it be? Obviously, each, as we know in criminal law and in law in general, each case is different. But still, given the overwhelming evidence of genocide that the South Africans presented, and that is, easily accessible within the public realm, to say that, okay, the Russians have to be ordered to cease fire immediately, stop immediately, but with the Israelis, no, maybe it's not really that far. I mean, I think is really a case of horrendous double standards. What the ICJ ordered was that Israel needs to abide by international law. And so we're gonna ask them, to submit a report in a month's time to sort of tell us how they have abided by international law. And the problem here is that the assumption seems to be that Israel is an actor with good intentions, and that it has the inclination to abide by international law. And name one time it actually has done this. It never has. I'm sorry, it's never done it. I mean, Israel is a serial violator of international law. And to look at what's happening now in isolation from what's been going on up till, from 48 and certainly from 67 and certainly from 2007, is really, I would say that is derelict in terms of the duties. So, I am disappointed by it. It could have been worse. It could have been far worse for sure, but it's not good enough. And of course, when we look and see first of all, of course, Israel announced immediately. They had been saying, from the get-go that they just were going to ignore any ruling that they didn't like. So that's not a surprise. But already, within hours of the ICJ decision being announced, the massacres were continued. They started invading another one of the hospitals, I think it was in Khan Yunis. The massacres never stopped. I mean, the massacres had always been continuing. And then they submitted this evidence, it seems, to UNRWA, and I suppose to the UN as a whole, of these alleged UNRWA staff members that allegedly had been involved in the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October. And so instantly, first of all, UNRWA acted a little bit too quickly, I must say, by summarily terminating the people that were still, 9 of the 12, I believe, because 2 of them had already been killed. And one of them, it wasn't clear who the guy was, apparently. That's not, there are a lot of things which remain unclear, but they announced immediately that they had summarily terminated most of the people that had been, accused of this by the Israelis. Now, again, we haven't seen the actual evidence. We have no idea, we have no idea really what this is about. But look, certainly in any kind of public body, any kind of government body, when accusations are leveled against one of the staff, they are put on administrative leave or whatever while the case is actually adjudicated. They're not just fired immediately. So they acted they acted way too quickly in my mind. And of course, then what happened is the United States and then a number of the other Western governments, and now Japan, has suspended its funding of UNRWA, which is a major blow. Of course, it is an obvious example of collective punishment, blaming the entire agency, which has 30,000 staff members, for the alleged actions of just a handful of these people. It's really outrageous. And so again, we see these double standards. I think some people have said, look, it's pretty clear that the Israelis had been sitting on this evidence and were waiting for an unfavorable ruling from the ICJ to submit it and basically distract the attention of everybody from what the ICJ had ordered. That could be. I mean, it sounds very much like something. It sounds very likely. But when you look at, okay, so the ICJ has decided that plausibly Israel may be guilty of genocide. What do the Americans do? What do the Brits? What do the Germans do? They are continuing to provide Israel with, an endless stream of weapons, endless supply of, funding in international fora and political support everywhere. And when it comes to just a handful of staff members, allegations in UNRWA, instantly, the money is suspended. So really, once again, we see these double standards, this utter sheer hypocrisy at play. So I fear that it may be, really we are heading towards the end of the international order as we know it. And that may not be a bad thing.
You're absolutely right, of course. The double standards are so glaring that at this point, to me, I need an explanation for why it is that large numbers of people in Europe and the US seem not to be able to see that. Because we have so much video evidence of massive war crimes committed by Israeli soldiers in broad daylight on camera again and again and again and again. Like so many, and all of that is not enough to actually stop the funding of that war, but allegation of 12 people out of 30,000 allegations, which at the beginning might even have come from interrogations, so torture
exactly.
of Palestinians. That is enough to end hundreds of millions of dollars of funding to a relief organization. This will be impossible for us to our children ever to explain how that could happen. I mean, this is just so grotesque that we will work on this for a long time to understand it. But the question I still have is whether I talked to Ilias Pantekas the other day, and he's also a great expert on human rights. And he said the ICJ ruling, although it doesn't call for an immediate ceasefire, it gives basically almost it vindicates South Africa on every point, and it will help in the very near future to go to the Security Council and also to start like local litigations in local and domestic courts, and thereby help put pressure on Israel, which at this point is really the only thing that can help. I mean, even a ceasefire order wouldn't help, of course. How do you see that? I mean, you have worked in the field of human rights. Do you see any way that this could be used domestically in order to really put pressure on Western governments, which are at this point the lunatics and need to change?
Yes, they're together in the entire sort of lunatic operation here. I completely agree, and I definitely agree with your previous guest. I mean, now it is a weapon that can be used and should be used by us, the citizenry. I mean, I think the sort of dissonance that you mentioned just now of how can it be that we normal Joes on the street are looking at what's happening and sort of accepting it. I actually think, most people don't accept it. Or at least, a very significant segment of the population of most of our countries. They look at what's going on and they see it. They see through these lies and they see what's happening. And, we've seen these demonstrations an outpouring of popular support for the Palestinian cause. They're continuing. They still are continuing in a lot of our countries, despite the best efforts of a lot of the governments to, crack down on them and prohibit saying, chanting, from the river to the sea and prohibit the Palestinian flag and all this kind of thing. These kind of demonstrations and showings of popular support are still happening. So, definitely the ICJ decision will be a tool in the hands of these activists and of us, the citizenry in general. I think what has to happen certainly is that, every single lever has to be pulled in terms of putting pressure on governments, the governments that are not just being complicit. I mean, they're aiding and abetting genocide by providing Israel with support, both material support and political support. And also, the big corporations, like the big, weapons dealers who continue to, provide this kind of support for the Israelis with sheer glee, and other big corporations that are still, doing business with Israel. It's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that has really made a difference, and it will continue to make a difference. And they're of the view that this is a massive victory for the movement, a massive defeat for Israel. And now it's really, the ball is in our court. Now we have to continue pushing. If you look back at apartheid South Africa, the Western governments really at the outset, they had no intention whatsoever of sanctioning South Africa. They were not interested in this at all. And it was really the citizenry and also a lot of the governments of the so-called global South and international fora that really pushed this forward. So I think that is really the way. That's the only way that we can see real progress on the ground. Unfortunately, it's not something which is going to happen tomorrow. I mean, of course, the pressure, we can continue doing it today and tomorrow. But changing the attitudes of these Western governments is may take a little bit of time, and that's something which certainly infuriates me and frustrates me and is very disappointing. But I don't see any other way. But in the longer term also, this kind of hypocrisy, this kind of sheer double standards, like you say, it's just unsustainable. And so, what does this mean for the international system as a whole? What does this mean for the international order as a whole? First things first, we have to make sure that the guns stop and the massacres stop in Gaza and the rest of Palestine. But in the mid to long term, this is also a big issue. This is a big issue that has to be dealt with, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in the short term, I mean, it's too late for the 30,000 Palestinians who've already died, probably 40, probably 50,000. I mean, we are going by the time this is over, we will be close to 100,000 dead, I suppose. I mean, this is as horrible as it is. And for these people in Gaza, it is too late. But it is not too late to save the Westbank and Ramallah. It's not too late to prevent the extermination and the ethnic cleansing of the rest of Palestine. So
yes,
you worked as a human rights lawyer. You are a human rights lawyer, and I know for a fact that people watching this channel, there's practicing lawyers and retired lawyers. Now, anyone who's thinking to themselves like, how could I put pressure on my own government? What can people do? What could you and I do in regard to the Japanese government? I mean, where we are living, or me as a Swiss citizen to the Swiss government? Now that we have the ICJ ruling in hand, is there something creative that you or I could do towards Japan to tell them,
sure,
fund UNRWA again, for F's sake?
Well, I think the legal tools are something that, I think that the lawyers, we have to sort of get together and really sort of go over what sort of possibilities there are. Within Japan, I would say they're pretty limited. But certainly, there are other methods of putting pressure on governments than, just sort of bringing litigation in the courts. In fact, when you look at how the sort of human rights agenda has been advanced in Japan, the court cases do make a difference. They're generally not successful, the cases themselves. Sometimes they are, but generally they're not successful. But they do act as a sort of method of bringing pressure on the parliamentarians and showing the parliamentarians that this is a very serious issue and they have to take it seriously. Now, I don't know exactly what sort of strategic moves we could make here in Japan in terms of litigation. I don't know if there's, there really are any, but certainly, showing members of parliament and showing also, people in big corporations that this is a very serious issue that they have to take seriously is something which can be effective. I think I might have mentioned this before, but I still sometime, not since the ICJ decision, but I have received calls, sort of very sort of informal sort of requests for advice from big Japanese corporations on issues regarding reputational risks or risks, human rights risks of doing business with Israeli partners, business partners. Ever since the second Abe government, there has been a huge, huge push within the government to sort of push corporations towards making a lot of deals with Israeli companies. Part of that was just sort of ultra-conservative politicians seeing Israel as a short path towards even better relations and even more cooperation with the Americans. But of course, we already have that anyway, so I think that was almost less of a factor. I think it was more sort of getting in cahoots with American allies in West Asia and the Middle East in general, so that sooner or later we could collaborate when the next time the Americans send their troops in and start some kind of never-ending war, then we go in with them and make sure we already know the people in the ground and make sure we get our cut of the resources that are stolen. I mean, I think that was really the idea. But whatever the sort of underlying strategy was, that was really, there was a huge push to do this. This is also connected, of course, with the general sort of push towards remilitarization here in Japan. General push towards exporting weapons and cutting weapons, all this kind of stuff. And Israel was looked upon as a really sort of a promising partner in terms of how do you say, development of weapons and just general sort of cutting deals and, all this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of pressure on this. Now, Japanese corporations I mean, there are a whole lot of them, so I don't want to generalize, but many of them are actually quite mindful of the reputational risk of doing business in this kind of with Israeli companies, in particular, of doing business in a way that could be acute, that could open them up to accusations of being complicit in the illegal settlement colonization of Palestine. So, I was getting calls from these sort of very sort of big name corporations saying, look, Saul, the situation is this. So the government is really twisting our arms, telling us that we have to do deals with Israel. I mean, do deals with an Israeli company, no matter what, they don't care. It's just do deals with Israel. This was the message from the top down. But we are very mindful that, we don't want to get involved in a situation where we are actually doing business with a company that is involved in the colonization process and the whole sort of illegal settlements, because we understand this is a big issue. And, it was less about the human rights risks as such and more just about we don't want to get tangled into this and get accused by NGOs, and we don't want to get into trouble. But, that's how these things start. So anyway, I was getting these kind of calls. And of course, I'd have to tell them, look, I'm sorry to tell you this, but there are no, what they were saying is, so they would ask me, could you direct us to like a clean Israeli company that we could do business with? Like an Israeli company. Yeah, I can see you laughing. I mean, an Israeli company that is not involved in the settlements so that we could do business with them and then everybody's happy. And so I would have to tell them, look, dudes, I'm sorry, but that's just not going to happen because these colonial settlements are not like, they're like tent cities. Every single Israeli company is involved in this, or at least every single Israeli company that has, that would have the capacity to be a business partner for a major Japanese multinational. These are cities. These are like cities that are like, it's like saying like, oh, I want to do business with a Japanese bank that's not involved, that has nothing to do with Sendai or Kanazawa. It's not going to happen. I mean, every single Israeli company over a certain, sort of scale is involved directly or indirectly in the colonial settlements. That's just how it is. The entire Israeli economy is built, or at least relies on, the colonization process, and of course the entire military complex. So, it's just not going to happen. I'm sorry, guys. It's just, dream on. And, they weren't happy with that advice, but, that was just how it was. So, these big corporations are wary of this. They are mindful. And the BDS movement in Japan has had successes. Like I remember, I remember like Mujirushi was thinking of opening, shops in Tel Aviv and sort of opening a big retail network. And this was quite a few years ago. This is before I actually came back from Palestine to Japan. But the BDS movement was successful in convincing them that this was not in their, not in their best interests and not in the best interests of human rights. So that was, one of the successes. Of course, for every success, there are other times when, when these movements were not able to prevent companies from doing deals with Israel and all that kind of thing. But, even any kind of success on this kind of front is a big blow for the apartheid system of Israel that wants to, that desperately clings on to what last sort of, vestiges of international legitimacy it feels it has. This is why they are so um, sensitive to what's happening in the United States, like in universities in the United States, and now more and more in the UK. And now, of course, since 7th of October, everywhere all over the West, right? I mean, they are using their sort of quangos, if you like, their sort of quote unquote civil society organizations that have close ties with the Israeli governments. And a lot of donors that are in this, this sort of loose network that has often been called the Israel lobby in the United States to put pressure on universities to clamp down on pro-Palestinian activism. They do this because they know, they see the writing on the wall. They do this because they see they're losing the battle for the public narrative, as we often say. And so, they see that they're losing the battle. That's why they're doing it.
Yeah, and the thing with the floodgates is that once they're open, they're really difficult to close, and the Israelis actually understand that. The pressure that can come from civil society, the ultimate the ultimate act would be if that then suddenly becomes state action, right? Because we know at the end of the day, it was also with South Africa the same thing. You needed actually the governments of the big states, the big players on board,
Yes,
and put real like state pressure. That's the only thing that can change it. But the way to build toward that is going through civil society, and that's something where 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 we can engage in and work with. Now,
exactly.
do you do you do you do you think that there is in the current system, the way that it exists, also like the human rights system and so on, and the international law system that we have, that there are additional ways that can be used that are not going through just the civil society route, but other avenues? I mean, the ICJ prove to me that okay, there is still life in this system, but it's also important to understand that the entire human rights legal body and legal system is only about 80 years old. It only emerged after the Second World War, right? We didn't have it before, and it is in this sense still pretty weak when compared to other parts of international law. But we've had these attempts at building court systems, ad hoc, but also permanent ones. And the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is separate from the ICJ, would be another avenue. But that thing seems to be thoroughly politically infiltrated and be under political control and not be an independent body. Now, what are your thoughts on the ICC and on the other potential legal avenues for international law?
Well, like you say, the ICC seems completely hopeless, and that's as an international lawyer or international human rights lawyer, it's a tough pill to swallow, and it's a tough thing to admit, because I started off my career with Amnesty International. This was in the 90s. It was quite a long time ago, and I remember going to the UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. You know, one of the main lobbying goals, probably the main lobbying goal of the entire organization of Amnesty International was, in fact, the ICC, the creation of an international criminal court, a permanent international tribunal that would try, you know, try crimes against humanity and the crime of genocide and war crimes, these serious human rights violations. You know, I remember working hard towards it, and you know, it was a big deal. I mean, it was something which was very important, I think, to the human rights movement in general. It was it was a great day, I felt, when it was created. You know, I remember like, for example, when I was in Palestine, and you know, we had young UN staff who would, you know, they would come to my office, they would work for us for a couple of years, and they'd like leave. Some of them I remember left felt quite burnt out. And they were like, oh, you know, this human rights thing, it's all, you know, it just doesn't work, it's not functioning, and it's just not, you know, we're not getting anywhere. We haven't made any progress with with what's happening in Palestine. And they would be very dejected. And I would be the one who would sort of try to, you know, I don't mean to sound like heroic or anything. I'm just trying to give them a pep talk, because I felt like, you know, look, when I was in Vienna in the World Conference on Human Rights and was lobbying for this permanent international tribunal, honestly, I wasn't sure it would ever actually happen. It seemed like a pie in the sky to me. I mean, it seemed like something which wasn't that realistic, to be honest. But we did it. I mean, we managed to do it. You know, for even so the creation of the ICC in 2002, and you know, over years we see that it had only indicted, you know, people from Africa, and you know, there already started to be a lot of cynicism. But I was always sort of the one who was defending it, and the one who was saying, look, you know, it is, you know, it's not perfect, that's true, but it is something. And we, you know, we spent years and years, decades and decades, we being the human rights movement, pushing towards the creation of this body, and pushing towards, you know, accountability for human rights violations. And so, you know, as human rights people, I believe that we are, you know, part of something bigger than each one of us. And you know, that's what the ICC was really about. It was one of the things that really, one of the milestones, and one of the sort of pieces of evidence that we actually could make a difference. But you know, looking and seeing over the past few years what's been its utter inaction towards Palestine, and the complete you know, difference, the complete double standards of how it's acted towards Palestine versus how it's acted towards Ukraine. I mean, it's you know, it's difficult for me to accept this, but I have to say that it's turned the whole concept of international criminal justice into just a joke. It's a sick joke. I mean, look, you know, Russia invades Ukraine. Within 4 days, the ICC announced that they were conducting an investigation. Within around 11 months, so under a year, we have the head of state of Russia, and you know, all these politicos, they've received indictments. So, you know, they act at a lightning speed. With Palestine, on the other hand, you know, it took 6 years for them to even say, okay, we're opening an investigation. And even that was after all these kind of ridiculous legal maneuvers by the previous prosecutor, who was clearly just trying to weasel out of the whole thing. You know, jurisdiction, do we really have jurisdiction? It was just nonsense, just really, you know, trying to kick the can down the road. So finally, after 6 years, you know, that's all been that's all been sort of overcome. And finally, we have this investigation, which has started. It's been 3 years since then. And what do we have? Nothing. We have no indictments. We have the current prosecutor clearly, you know, going soft on Israel. You know, if you look at the statements he's made since the 7th of October, very, very hard on Hamas. And with Israel, it's just, yeah, I mean, he does say that they have to abide by international law, but it's like completely kid gloves if you look at the kind of language he's using, and really say, oh, you know, Israel is an advanced country, and should be able to abide by international law, and you know, we trust that it will. That seems to be the insinuation. And I think, you know, I see that sort of also with the ICJ decision as well. The ICJ decision is better than, you know, these scandalous statements by the ICC prosecutor, but you know, still this sort of insinuation, or this still assumption that Israel can be should be and will be a law-abiding, global law-abiding member of the international community. This is just really, it's just, you look at what's happened up till now. I mean, over the decades, it's really nonsense. This is something, this is sort of a bone I have to pick, not just with international law, but with law in general, because of course we tend to, law tends to divorce specific incidents, specific cases from the general context. That is what, as lawyers, we tend to be trained, we're trained to do that. And, to look at the trees and almost to sort of forget about the forest. And that is I feel that's one of the big shortcomings with international law in general, and certainly in the way that these structures have dealt with the case of Palestine. Now, so besides the ICC, you asked about the other sort of mechanisms that exist. Of course, there are these mechanisms. There's a Security Council. I mean, I don't want to get it. We're going to start laughing again if we start talking about the Security Council. But there's a Security Council, which it really is the only body in the UN that can take, binding, mandatory actions of enforcement. And then there are, of course, all the UN treaty bodies and the council, the Human Rights Council that can adopt, and the General Assembly that can adopt, yet more resolutions to be ignored by Israel and the United States. They can create even more fact-finding missions and panels of investigation, which can be refused cooperation with by Israel. So there are those kind of bodies, but really we go back to the Security Council. And, what's going to happen with that? Again, and this is where we get back to having to put pressure on the powerful governments that are backing Israel, in particular the United States, because of course, it's the US that's key with this. The US has to change, and it will change. I mean, I'm very sort of optimistic about that, but it's just, it's hard to sort of be sort of optimistic and cheerful, when, like you said, when we see these massacres of innocent civilians in Gaza day after day. So that is that's very difficult to be, but definitely the writing is on the wall in the United States. And the thing about these things, and also about public opinion in the United States specifically, is that it can change very dramatically. It can be, all of a sudden, it can go from this one extreme to the other. And, we have, sociologists and anthropologists looking and saying, oh, but, this was coming for 20 years or 30 years. And, I guess they're right. But, it can change very sort of dramatically. And I feel that we might be at that point now. I hope so.
Yeah, and they're right post facto.
Yeah, exactly. They're right post facto. It's like you look at what happened with the Berlin Wall, and it's like, oh, well, we saw this, but the fact that nobody saw it. Nobody saw it. But these things happen.
Also Pearl Harbor and so on, the big moments when big changes come. I mean, the whole idea is like you don't foresee them. But I would just like to point out that also, just to add one more insult to injury, is that Israel, of course, the entire time, and now too, keeps claiming that it adheres to the T to international law and to humanitarian law and human rights law, and that it has the most moral army in the entire world.
We've heard that so many times.
It's like, while it shoots innocent people, it keeps saying we would never shoot innocent people. That's the lunacy. So it's really easy for them in speech acts to comply with what the ICJ said, because they can say, like, we've always said we adhere to it.
Exactly.
We will adhere to it.
Exactly. That's exactly the point.